In this video, we're going to take a look at Noodler's Esenin. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. Noodler's tends to take so much trash talking that I'm going to try to be kind of easy in how I explain what I see going on here. Now, I don't like this particular ink, not because it's a red, but because it's aggressive against paper. Like, if you have a dog you're trying to bring into your home, but it's aggressive with other dogs, it doesn't work out. And this is aggressive on just about every paper I put it onto. And you're going to see it come up in the writing samples. You must use really high quality paper in order to control these issues with this ink. Now, as a color, it is a solid performer. It has no shading and no tone variation by pen, just a good solid red the entire way. Now, it wasn't hard to clean from the pens, so I'm not saying it's aggressive in that way. It's just aggressive towards paper. All of them. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Franklin Christoph Model 66 with a broad sig nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we get, I'm going to say the lightest tone we're going to get here because it's only slightly lighter. Now, we're not really getting any kind of feathering. We're not getting any spread. We're not getting any shading. In general, I want to say on the front, this looks really good. Looking at the broad nib, it is a tad bit darker than we had with the fine. Now we get no feather, no spread, no shading, solid red all the way. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone that we had with the broad. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's not shading, it's a solid red that isn't any kind of a problem and isn't unpleasant to look at. Now, I say unpleasant to look at because in general, I don't go for reds, but that doesn't mean an ink is bad. Looking at the back of the page, you see that it never touched the page underneath, but the ink got very deep in there, really started getting almost wanting to dot through. We are getting some ghosting, very unusual for this paper. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Lamy All-Star with a fine nib. A Lamy All-Star with a broad nib. A Lamy Safari with a 1.1 stub. The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad. Looking at the fine nib, we get a lighter red than I would have in general actually thought from this ink, but it's still a decent red. Now, there's a tiny bit of feathering that is occurring on this paper. You're going to see it in the word indomitable on the second line. You're going to see it in, well, a lot of the words. It's there, it's minor, but it is there. No real spread, no shading, just red. Looking at the broad nib, just a tad bit darker. And when I'm saying it, because I know they said there was no shade or no tone variation, it's only the slightest, and I'm not sure that it's going to completely come through on camera. Now, we do get a tiny bit of feathering, very manageable in what's happening here. We're not getting any kind of spread, so that's doing very well. It is not shading, but reds typically don't, and this one doesn't. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone that we had with the broad. We get less feathering than we had with the others, and what we had with the others was really tiny, probably not coming through on camera unless I zoom it way in. No spread, no shading, solid red performing. I'm hoping it works out on the back. Looking at the back of the page, it did better than it did on the Clairfontaine. There's no bleeding, no ghosting, good paper for this ink. Keep that in mind. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the WritePad. Now, we get the same amount of tiny feathers, really barely worth mentioning, but they are kind of there. We get no spread, we get no shading. It's, I think, fairly good here, and I think looking at this, I got a feeling this one may do fairly well when we get to the back of the page, because it didn't do bad on the right, and it's looking around the same here. Looking at the broad nib, just like on the WritePad, just a tad bit darker with very minor feathering. Really pretty good. There is the tiniest bit of spread happening here, but then again, you're writing with a broad nib in a reporter pad, so fault goes to the user. But there is a little bit of spread with this paper. No shading, good red tone, very pleasant, not obnoxious. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone that we had with the broad. We get no feathering. We get no spread. We get no shading. We get a good red. I'm actually thinking this is some of the best that we're getting right here in terms of its overall and all of it performance. This might be the nib needed for this paper with this ink. Looking at the back of the page, there's no ghosting, and there's no bleeding that came through and touched the page underneath. So, outstanding combination here. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, it is a little lighter than we've gotten on the previous writing samples. Now, we're not really getting any feathering, nothing. This paper's generally done fairly well, and it continues to hold up well. We're not getting any spread, we're not getting any shading, but it is that little bit lighter red tone. I'm still going to say this right here is a win if it holds up with this kind of performance on sheet paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little darker than we had with the fine. We get no feather, but we do get the tiniest bit of spread. Absolutely no shading. I'm going to say this is really solid here in what's happening. The tone, to me, is a little nicer than what I was getting from the fine, even though it's that only tiny bit darker. It's the tiniest bits in the ink that really make all of the difference. At least I think so. Looking at the stub nib, same tone as the broad. No feather, no spread, no shading. Once again, this stub is showing itself to be what you should use with this ink on cheaper papers because it is doing an especially nice job. The majority of what's here, beautiful. When it's not beautiful, that's my fault. Now, looking at the back of the page, there's a ton of ghosting. It looks like it would bleed, but in fact, it did not bleed and touch the page underneath. You just can't write on the back of this page. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Ackerman number 17. Here is Diatramentis Document Red. Here is Diamine Wild Strawberry. Here is Noodler's Cayenne. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get a decent red tone, though we do get a tiny bit of feathering. It's back. We do get a little bit of spread. That doesn't look so much like a fine as it does a medium here. We get no shading. I want to say that on a majority this doesn't look bad looking at the front of it, but this paper notoriously has not done well. That says it nicely. Looking at the broad nib, a tad bit darker than we had with the fine. It does feather, it does spread, both of them just a little bit, but totally manageable. It's just the point that it's there, not that it's in itself a problem. I'll really harp on it if it's the kind of problem that's distracting, which this is not. So, as long as the page underneath can survive, we could have a winner. Looking at the stub nib, I want to say that we get no feathering, although later on a third, fourth, or fifth line of writing, you are going to see the tiniest bits of feathering that is going on. There is a little bit of spread going on. The spread is too much for me with this paper, so I wouldn't use that stub nib on this paper, but on a majority, that stub has done fairly well for this ink. Looking at the page underneath, it is a minefield that cannot be passed by the amount of bleeding that touched the page underneath. And when you see the page on the back, you understand why. It completely ghosted everything. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a blue-black ink by Colorverse, their Season 1 Proxima B. Here is a gray ink by Robert Oster, their Graphite. Here is a blue ink by Sailor, their Gentle Four Seasons Yuki Akari. Here is a black ink by Birmingham Pen Company, Allegheny Arsenal Gunpowder Black. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, it's a lighter red than I would have really preferred, lighter than I really expected based on any of the other writing samples. It does feather a tiny bit, very manageable to be honest. It does spread a tiny bit, again very manageable. It does not shade, giving a nice solid red, and I'd say it could make it a good grading ink as long as it doesn't destroy the next paper, making them think that they've ruined everything and done it all wrong. Looking at the broad nib, it is right about the same tone that we had with the fine. It does feather, it does spread. It's distracting a couple of times, but on the majority, I want to say that the feathering isn't something that would stop a lot of people from using this. So for me, there's gonna come parts that it bothers me quite a bit, but the majority, I think it's not too bad. Looking at the stub nib, same tone that we had with the fine and the broad. It does feather, it does spread, it does not shade. It is a red. Now this red, as it was for all of the pens here, is not the same red that we got with other papers. It is in general a little bit lighter, a little faded in its look. Not horrible, but just something to be aware of. Looking at the page underneath, you see there's a ton of spots where it bled through and touched the next page. And when you see the back of the page, you understand why with the extreme amount of ghosting, which is happening. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? I would want to control the amount of aggression that this ink can have in its bleeding. And to do that, I would really want to use a drier, finer pen. And by doing that and selecting the right paper, and Clairfontaine might not be that paper, but the right pad did very well, and the FieldNotes did very well. So you can find some cheaper papers or non-fountain pen paper. I don't want to call them cheaper. Non-fountain pen paper that'll do well with this ink. Make sure you match it with the right pen. It's a shame to say that I think it's a dry fine, considering I did think the stub looked the best. I hope you got something out of this video, and if it leads to you wanting to try this ink, when you purchase it, let the retailer know where you heard about it, whether it's me or any other channel. Thanks for watching.